Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson. We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. You know, I think that podcast listeners must just be so thrilled to hear descriptions of clothing on a podcast. So, if you want to see why Coleman, hey Coleman, why Curt is calling me the flowered one, it's because yes. It turns out that I am wearing a floral shirt on this late Friday afternoon, getting ready for the weekend as I'm here. So if you want to take a look at it, go over to the YouTube channel and check it out. It's quite something. So we are here today in episode 8 of the Being Known podcast for season 5. And as you know or should know by now, we are going through Dr. Curt Thompson's book, The Soul of Shame. And today we are in chapter 7. And chapter 7 is titled Our Healing Cloud of Witnesses. And again, Curt, I am really enjoying going through this book again. It's been a long time since I've had the opportunity, and going through it week by week like this with you has been really terrific. I wish it could have happened the first time I read it. So I'm happy that we're doing this for our listeners, and thank you for bringing it to us.
Yeah, it's a joy to do it, and hoping that folks are having the opportunity to move from a place where shame tends to want to straitjacket us, and moving to a place where we have greater freedom and a greater sense of being able to create the things that we were made to create in the world.
How does it feel for you? How is it feeling for you going back and going through this book again after, a few years now since you wrote it? Is this a good feeling? Is this,
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I know that, as an author, I it's not like I've written 30 books, but I am aware of authors, that you write a book and then you move on to the next book and you move on to the next book and so forth and so on for many. And I think that it's turned out that this particular book continues to have a bit of staying power if you watch the trends of who's buying which of the pieces that I've written. And I think it may have staying power because our topic, unfortunately, has staying power. Mm-hmm. And we it's not like we ever complete our tour of duty with shame. It is a thing that we are going to continue to respond to, because evil's not, as we like to say, it's not going to go quietly into the night. It's going to forever attempt to continue to use any and all of those old ancient neural networks that represent our remembered past, our remembered moments of shame. And so the work of shame is just, I think, continuing to practice being connected in vulnerable community, not unlike we talked about last week a little bit, and we're going to talk explicitly today. Being connected in vulnerable community in such a way that we are able to address that. Now, my experience is that, I don't know if I mentioned this on the podcast here before. I was talking with Phyllis, my wife, 2 or 3 months ago, and I was saying I used to think that growth for me is primarily measured in terms of becoming more of the person I want to be. I want to be a person of greater love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, those kinds of things. And that, I could say, I think I'm more patient than I was 6 months ago or a year ago or something, or I'm more joyful, or any of those things. And I think that's not untrue. I think those things are true. I said, but I've also come to discover that there's another element of growth that I really don't like, that I wish were different, and that is the element of, as we actually become more deeply known, I become increasingly aware of all the real estate that needs now to be redeemed. I become increasingly aware of all the stuff and all the places that I don't have everything together.
Hmm.
And you get this impression that, each of us, kind of like has been given a significant tract of land by God, and we get to do with it what we will. And I surrender that to Jesus, and Jesus plants his flag and says, "This is great. I'm glad that this is that we're going to work this land together." And then you spend the rest of your life like going throughout the county or going throughout the counties of the country that belongs to you, over which you have been given stewardship. And I'm like, I didn't even know that I had this county in my contract.
Hmm.
I didn't even know that this is. And he's like, well, yeah. And the longer we're together, the more we're going to like travel around and see all the different places of the land that belongs to you that is beautiful, and all the places where, as it turns out, you have that one space that's a, nuclear waste dump. And let's work on that. We really want to work on that. And so there are the moments of like, gosh, you don't really get to expand your growth in terms of like, oh, we'll cultivate this tract of land and then we'll grow corn over here. We'll grow wheat over here. We're going to plant cherry trees over here. Oh, and then there's the nuclear waste site. And I'm like, at some point you're like, do I really want to keep exploring all this land that has been given to me? Because like, I get the picture. And I think there is this sense in which shame is one of evil's most potent weapons at trying to corrupt our ongoing growth in stewardship of the tracts of land that we've been given. And it figures, oh, you don't want to look at that. There's 400 acres over there. You don't want to look at that. And I think God is inviting us, and then this is what we've said as we'll get to toward the end of our book, is this whole notion that when Jesus comes to Peter in John 21 and he starts to say, "Do you love me?" It is this enterprise of like he's not gonna allow for there to be any square inch of Peter's soul that is left in the darkness of shame. Jesus is coming to find every square inch of it. And of course, this is hard because it's painful. It's exposing. However, the more practice that we have, the more willing I am to like, okay, we'll go find the next tract of land, because I saw what we just did at the nuclear waste site. We cleaned that up. Okay, we're gonna continue to work on that waste site. That's never gonna end.
Yeah, even when you think, yeah, I'm done with that.
Right. Yeah. That's the other thing that you like to think, right? Like, oh, check that box.
I dealt with that. It's gone. It's done.
Right.
Yeah.
It's done. And then you're like, dang.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, one of the ways that we now want to approach it to make it more like a strategy and a set of tactics for how we begin to approach this, how we live into vulnerability. How did Carla, from our last episode, how does she begin to really press into this question of healing and regeneration or recommissioning? Begins with a model that I think that we would find in the 12th chapter of Hebrews, verses 1 through 2. And this is a model that we've then extended and kind of blown up into what has, for those of you who've listened to other seasons of our podcast, when we talk about confessional communities, the confessional communities are really what grew out of this notion of a healing cloud of witnesses that we're going to talk about. And so we like to say that if healing from shame and its recommissioning and our regeneration into new creators, co-creators with Jesus of places of goodness and beauty, we like to begin at the beginning. And we start we're just going to name Hebrews 12, 1 through 2. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off all the sin that so easily entangles us, and then let us walk with perseverance the race that has been set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher or completer or champion of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and now sits at the right hand of the Father. We're just going to walk through that because those words provide a structure, a framework, a model for how we can enter into this process. And this whole notion that, therefore, since we have before such a great cloud of witnesses, Hebrews 12 begins where Hebrews 11 left off, which is in which the writer lists an array of people of the faith who have been faithful. Some have been faithful and done so with great glory. Others have been faithful and have paid for it with their lives. There's no guarantee that we get out of this world on our terms. But it's these people that the writer is referring to, which, really kind of already is kind of prompting our imagination to recognize that there are other people in the room. And it's an echo of Genesis chapter 1, this whole notion of let us make mankind, that it's not just me and a singular God. The Trinitarian God of the Bible invites us into a meal where there are people around already. They want us to be there. There's not just one person. Like they had three people who they all want us to be there. This notion that my mind needs a community. My mind longs for a community. It's one thing to walk into a space where you're at a party and there's one person that and that person sees you when you walk in and they come over and they're really, but imagine if you come to a party and there's like 8 or 12 people there and like a half dozen of them or all of them stop what they're doing and just welcome you into the room. This is this cloud of witnesses that are seeing us and with us. And this notion that they do so as kind of a recapitulation of this Genesis 2:25, like we invite you into this space to be vulnerable. We invite you into this space to be who you are, to be differentiated, right? Male and female, this sense that like I'm going to be with people who are not like me. They're not all carbon copies, which means there will be parts of me that perhaps, I don't know if they're going to like them or not like them. There are parts of me that I know that I don't like. Maybe you're not going to like them. Maybe you're not going to want them there. But there is this sense that we're differentiated, that we are naked, that we are vulnerable. And it's a space where shame is not going to have the talking stick. And that's important because shame will look for an opportunity to go anywhere it is given room to breathe. And part then of that follows next, since we had this great cloud of witnesses, one of the first things that we ask is, who are the people that are in your life that are your cloud of witnesses? Who are they? Could you name them? You might say, well, no, Curt, or no, Pepper. I don't have them. How do I find them? As we'll come to later, and as we've talked about in other episodes, like these are things that we have to create sometimes. These are not things that are just going to be out there in the world. We just look it up on Google. Cloud of witnesses. Where do I find cloud of witnesses near you? Like Five Guys, right? It's like Five Guys near me. No, it's not. It's not how they work. We have to really do the work of considering that we're going to have to create this community that is joyful in our presence, no matter my condition, but who are also there to help set limits, because the next thing that we read is, since you've got this great cloud of witnesses, it then says throw off everything that entangles, throw off every sin that entangles. This isn't a community that welcomes you in and say like, we're going to welcome you in as you are, and you can be whoever you want to be regardless, forever. Jesus comes with good news of our being welcomed to the table of the Father and the Spirit and the Son. And that is going to require certain conditions. Not to be loved, not to be invited, but I can't come to that table and be committed to my addictions. I can't come to that table and be committed to my shame. I can't come and be committed to my, not because they won't let me in, but because that part of me that wants to live that way isn't going to survive that much beauty, isn't going to survive that much love, isn't going to survive that much reality. The parts of me that are ashamed are not going to survive light that is that bright. And so the writer is very clear. This is a group that is also going to welcome and invite me to name my sin. One of the translations reads, throw off the sin that so easily distracts us. And one of the things that we talk about is this notion that all sin begins with distraction. Eve was distracted, right? The serpent was subtle. His power was in his subtlety. He's like a magician. It's a sleight of hand. It's a sleight of word. It's a sleight of emotional state. It's a distraction. And distractions are what lead to wounding. And this is what I must say no to. And it's hard to do that. It's hard to say no, but this is why we know that people who are in recovery groups for substance abuse, for pornography, for anywhere that we are able to say no to things that there's a part of me that really wants to say yes to. Like I really want the heroin. I really want to look at porn. I really want to have that more intimate conversation with that man or that woman who's not my spouse, but who's married to somebody else, or I'm married. Well, like I want to, this thing, this hunger, this, I really want to do that. To say no to that is really hard to do. Like, if it weren't, right? I mean, there wouldn't be, like, it's like, I was reading this, book chapter on temptation, and he was citing a Victor Borge, what's the comedian who was the pianist?
Borgia, yeah, Victor Borgia, Victor
right?
Borg, yeah,
Victor Borg,
yeah,
Victor Borg, and he's doing this set piece, and he's like, he's talking about Adam and Eve, and this quip on temptation, and Eve, in a fit of like personal insult, says to Adam, "Do you love me?" And Adam turns to her and says, "Who else?" Right? I mean, it's hard. It's difficult for us to say no. But from the beginning, we have been, the creation was arranged in such a way that the option to say yes to sin was available. We're not going to be able to become the people of beauty and goodness, the people of weighted glory that Paul talks about, unless we have the option to sin, to which we then say no. But the people in the recovery rooms will tell you, people in AA and NA will tell you, like, I'm able to say no primarily because I'm taking somebody else with me. The longing that I have, I'm going to practice having that be met right here in this room, to acknowledge this is the longing that I have, and to have them say, yep, we really get it. And the longing is legit.
Yeah, and I'm sure that you don't want to go back in the room and have to say, have to go through the act of, admitting it. And
Right.
And if you're in those rooms and you're building those relationships, you don't want to go back and lie to them. So
Right.
that's almost a deterrent to it as well, I would think.
Right. Yeah, there is a degree to which shame does become a deterrent, and as we've said, that's not a bad thing. It is an indicator. As we've said earlier in this season, there are acts that we commit for which shame is the proper response. Those kinds of behaviors are things for which, and I want to avoid that. The challenge, of course, is if the only reason that I have for not indulging in my sin is to avoid shame, that becomes problematic. The thing that is going to most sustain me is if my relational connections to other people is moving toward what I do want ultimately, rather than simply trying to keep me away from what I don't want. So we see then how saying no is something that we can do more courageously and more effectively when we're in the middle of community, because my brain is not as alone. The saying no, I worry that I'm not going to have access to the thing that I long for, the thing that I want, that ultimately leads to shame. And I'm actually searching for it in the first place anyway because of my shame, because I'm not enough. I'm not going to get enough of what I have, so I'm going to go there to get that. But in community, people can validate that my longing, not for the thing I want to misuse, but what's behind it, my longing to be seen, soothed, safe, secure. And that becomes what I pay attention to that can enable me to say no to these other things. But it takes a lot of work, because that, is friends of mine, like a patient of mine who's been sober for 20 years, and he says, look, the only thing that stands between me and disaster is one drink. And so he knows that it's not a matter like I haven't stopped this thing, and our shame is, it's still embedded. We're just having to build new neural networks. That's really what we're doing all the time. And then this moves us to this next line that we're gonna say no while we walk with perseverance. We're gonna practice over and over and over again. It takes perseverance. We walk with perseverance on this journey, on this race that has been laid out for us. Noticing that, like, I'm not ultimately the master of my own destiny. The race has been laid out by somebody else. It's hard for me, but the point is not to say you don't get to choose. The point is to say, I want you to know that you're not by yourself. Somebody else is thinking on your behalf of your race. That when you get to hard places, you need to know God has provided this for you because he loves you, and he's inviting you into this hard place because it's going to help you become more capable of holding the weight of glory that is coming for you. And otherwise, I just remain too fragile. So I'm going to persevere. I'm going to practice in this community, fixing our eyes on Jesus. And that means that we watch what he does and we do what he does. Watching him at his baptism, being receptive to God's love. You're my son, whom I love, and am well pleased. In our community, we need to have the experience and the practice of hearing people say, Pepper, man, I'm just so glad to be in the room with you. And to not brush that off, but to allow ourselves to receive it, and it's hard to receive. It's embarrassing. It's too intimate. It's too present. While at the same time, it is what my soul hungers and thirsts for, like nothing, to hear my dad say, man, I'm so pleased with you. It's hard because I know of all the things that I would assume he's not going to be very pleased with. He's like, oh, no. I know about those parts. I want you to hear what I'm telling you. I want you to pay attention to me. And in so paying attention to that, I am then able to walk with him into other rooms where I worry that he wouldn't be pleased. Whereas it turns out he's already waiting for me. So I'm going to watch what Jesus does at his baptism. I'm also going to watch what he does in the very following chapter in the Gospels, running from, for instance, Matthew 3 to Matthew 3 to Matthew 4, Luke 3 to Luke 4, this notion of his temptation. This notion that when evil comes for him, he's able to say, it is written. And for Jesus to say, it is written, it's like him saying, yeah, but my dad says. We all have these experiences of when we were, as kids, perhaps glad in those moments where we could say, my dad says. I'm not just banking on my authority that I know feels flimsy at the moment. I'm actually banking on the authority of someone who's bigger and badder than me.
There was a time when I was a kid and I was walking down the street, and I was probably 13, 14, something like that. And a kid from the neighborhood who was 16 was driving his car, and screwing around and coming like at me, right? And so um uh and I didn't know it. And I turned around and he's right there. And I jumped up on my instinct was to jump. I jumped up on the hood of his car and my hand went into his windshield and broke his windshield.
Wow.
So,
I'm not messing with you anymore. That's for sure.
so, uh, later, like that evening, this boy shows up with his dad at my house with a lie saying that I did this to their car on purpose and I owe them
Oh,
money for their car.
oh my gosh.
To which my dad, who was standing right there, who I had already told the story to of what had happened, was like, this isn't happening here. And basically told him to leave. And that was just when you were telling us talking about that, my dad who was like
Mm,
standing up for me
mm,
in that moment,
mm,
where lies were being told about me and they were
mm,
telling me I owed them
mm.
money and all this kind of thing. And just to feel his protection in that moment and was pretty powerful. I feel it right now as I'm telling the
Yeah.
story, right?
I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, I know we only have so much time here, but I really want us together, you and me and our listeners,
Mm.
to just sit with this and to sense that this is what our God wants us to hear. Like, that's not happening here. When our shame attendant comes to find us, when evil is the wolf at the door, that's just such a beautiful. That's the first time I've heard that story. That's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
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 Well, this is what we say, that even in our healing cloud of witnesses, that we watch what Jesus does, then we do what he does, and by doing what he does, meaning that we are going to become for each other in this community what Jesus and the Father and the Spirit share. We are going to become Jesus' eyes and voice for each other. We are going to hear each other say, "Gosh, I'm just so glad that you're in the room." I'm going to hear God say, "Where are you?" I'm going to hear you ask me, "Where are you?" I'm going to hear you want me to say, "What's the truth about where I am?" Even the parts that I don't like, that I'm not enjoying, or that I hate, that I'm afraid, my sin, as it were. In order for me not to be alone with it, in order for me to be transformed and repent and turn and move in a direction that I really do long to be moving in. And that requires that we actually practice what we like to say, we practice acts of imagination, moving from imagination then to incarnation. We've talked before in a previous season about confessional communities and about the role that they play. And again, I forget if we've said this here before, but we don't have a lot of evidence in the Old Testament. We don't have a lot of instances in which we see the writers using the metaphor of the body as being descriptive necessarily of, for instance, the kingdom of Israel or the people of God, so for the body, his people, truly. But by the time Paul comes along and uses the body of Christ as a metaphor, I mean, we now 2,000 years, like we people of faith, we hear that and it's just like, it doesn't really capture our imagination. It doesn't really. It's kind of like watching paint dry. We were just so familiar with it. But we have to remember that when Paul writes this, it would have been completely anathema, completely counter to the culture, where the culture was a place where the culture of the time, outside of the Hebrew, like you could do with your body whatever you wanted to. It was a thing that you owned, and we used your body. I use we use other people's bodies. Like the body wasn't something to be honored. The body is something to be used. And if I was a Roman citizen, I could go use somebody else's body, whoever's body that I wanted to, who wasn't a citizen. If they were a slave, I could have sex with them. I could have them do things like I could do whatever I wanted to do because the body was not honored. The body was not honorable. Gnostics would say we doing everything we can to get away from the body. We just need to think our way to heaven. We just have these enlightened but Paul grounds us in Genesis 1:2 that we are created beings. And so he moves us into this notion that in a confessional community, I'm going to hear your voice. I'm going to see you seeing me. All this embodiment is the very material world that the Holy Spirit is moving within and through as a way to create goodness and beauty in the world. This notion that we love each other with our minds means I'm going to love each other with my presence, with my physical presence. My witness with you is going to be intentional in its direction. We're going to move toward Jesus, moving from what and for instance, we talk about this notion that I worry that I'm not going to be okay. I long to be okay in the future, in which if I'm in the room with you, I sense my being okay right here and now. And then this collecting of my story, collecting these stories of healing, makes it possible for me to take those stories with me. I hear your story, you hear mine, and I begin to take the stories of my cloud of witnesses with me into my day. Not just their stories, but their story of me. It's often very different than the one that I'm telling of me. One of the practical ways that we address this is by we invite people to do this little exercise that
take inventory.
Yeah, it's just at first glance it's just not very fun. But this shame inventory that we like to say, you keep your friends close, you keep your enemies closer. And this is a proactive and a preemptive way of naming our shame to tame it. And it's a way that helps us practice being beyond and before words or cognition. We start to pay attention to what I sense and image and feel. This whole sense of the Carla's story, for instance, as it was before, right? She and her husband moved into this time of regeneration. It was terrifying for her at first, but they began to do their work together, and he was in a confessional community. They started to do this work together, but it didn't mean that everything suddenly they didn't just here's the problem, here's the solution, and now we're great.
Right. I was going to say that if you start taking a shame inventory, chances are you're not going to fill the shelves, right? Because you're not going to even know in the beginning necessarily what's all in the inventory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I remember when we first years ago, when we first started to do this, we'd take your 3x5 card and, just make a mark on it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I just want you to just pay attention to when you sense, image, feel, think of, or want to do something with your body in which shame is the provocative element of the moment. And I remember having one guy that came back to me once. He said, I actually have a job that I have to do. That I have to earn money, and I don't have time to be doing this. He said, by 10 o'clock, I filled up both sides of 1 3x5 card. I don't have what? Right. Because the purpose of the inventory is not to figure it all out. The purpose is for you to become increasingly attuned and aware to its ubiquity, to its presence, that it's just everywhere. And all we want to do is stop it, is to pause it. Because to pause the process, means we begin to practice giving ourselves space to breathe, exhale, and then turn our attention back to our cloud of witnesses, our attention back to Jesus. These are literally interpersonal neurobiological exercises that we are enacting that get us to a point where we are practicing becoming different people. We are renewing the mind. And this is what Carla had to do. They would have times, even after they'd started to see progress and movement in their relationship, there would be other times when something would come up. her husband had, Preston had done something or not done something and so forth. And the old stuff started to come up for her, and she would be flooded with memories of her relationship with her boss. And she, it would feel good. And she would just want to sit with that. And it would be maddening for her. And even to this day, like, those experiences don't just go away forever. It's not like she never thinks about her boss, but the acuity, the intensity with which that longing is present for her is very, very different than it was when her healing process began. So we strengthen our capacity, but we to resist that. But we have to remember that the sooner that we pay attention, as we said, like as time would go on, she would discover that she would start to pay attention. Oh, I'm sensing this thing. Instead of just giving into it, she would say, oh, that's my shame attendant talking. And I'm going to pause right now. Instead of waiting for 10, 15, 30 minutes when she's kind of gone down the rabbit hole. That kind of practice enables us to pause and enter into the recreation of the new story that we're trying to create. And in this way, we are essentially doing what we say that Jesus did with the cross, that we're scorning shame for the joy set before us. We're identifying shame and saying, like, I don't thank you. Like, I get it. I don't need you. We're not even trying to be angry. We don't need to be angry with the attendant. We're not trying to get rid of the attendant in that way. We want to identify it so that we can ignore it, so we can turn our attention away and turn our attention toward those parts of me. Like, if that shame attendant is coming, it's coming for a reason. Not just to devour me, but it's also letting me see that there is a part of me that longs for something, part of me that hungers and thirsts for something. So it can draw my attention to that instead of to my addiction. And the thing that I long for is this joy. And I have to come back to my community in order for me to find joy in that community, to be reminded of the joy that Jesus has in my presence, the joy that the Trinity has, the joy that Jesus was setting his face toward even on Good Friday. And in this way, we run this race with perseverance. We practice together, doing a lot of things. And we see then that we recognize and have to remember that this practice in community is not just something that I'm doing for myself personally, but as a community, we are having to do it. What we really like to say is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a bigger train. The 9th chapter of John's Gospel tells the story of a blind man who Jesus and his disciples came upon. And their first comment to Jesus is like, who sinned, right? They're just getting the shame dagger out. They're just saying, like, what, who's it, this guy or his parents? And Jesus is like, no. It's the wrong question to be asking. It's not who sinned, him or his parents, but this man was born blind such that the glory of God might be revealed. And that story goes on to tell of a man who was then healed. Jesus heals him, and then all hell breaks loose because then people are upset about this. The neighbors tell the attorneys, and the attorneys drag this guy in, and they drag his parents in, and then this guy in, and then the guy starts to yank their chain, like, oh, you must want to believe in him too. And they put him out of the community. And what this story really tells is not about the blindness of a man, but the blindness of a community, the shame of a community. And this is what happens, that shame becomes a situation in which the whole is larger than some of its parts. And so we need a community. As we say, if our shame is like a locomotive, I'm not going to stop that locomotive by just pushing against it myself. That's what my shame is like. My shame is like a locomotive. It's not like a little red radio flyer wagon coming at me that I could easily stop. It's like a locomotive. And it doesn't come at me all that fast, but its mass effect is something I can't stop. And so I need the mass effect of a bigger train of my community that will help me push back against that. Just to be reminded that there are those of us who will hear this and will say, like, yeah, I really want to do that. But in my family of origin, we might not even be living in that family of origin again, but how many people still are impacted by their families of origin, right? I'm 40 years old, but I'm 60 years old. And I'm still my parents, we have to recognize that when you choose to turn toward the light, when you choose to no longer cooperate with the system, like under the system in John 9, the system will not necessarily be cooperative with you. it may want you to maintain the system. And so therein lies the need for Jesus to come and find you, for us to maintain this community of our own, in the same way that Jesus came to find the blind guy after his community had put him out for being healed. And so once again, we recognize that, it'd be tempting to think, oh my gosh, here's a great model. Hebrews 12, 1 through 2. We're just going to step into it and apply it, and everything will be great. And we have to remember that, again, evil sees this and sees the work that you want to do, and understands that this is your declaration of war against it, and will come with all that it has. And in fact, the more we grow, the stronger will be those temptations to turn away from our community, away from our healing cloud, and toward our own isolated way of trying to handle things like we used to do in those old systems. But we are about building a bigger train. We are about going to the very places where shame exists in order for us to turn the stone over, for us to reveal it in order for it to be healed and recommissioned. And toward that end, for our application this week, just want to invite you this week, each day, it doesn't take very long, just to read Hebrews 12, 1 through 2. And then, as always, I want you to journal about what reflections come to mind about each of the elements that we've reviewed in the podcast today. What parts encourage or energize you? What parts intimidate or frighten you? Begin to practice keeping a shame inventory, but again, not on your own. You don't want to just do this and then have that sit with you. You want to have someone that you can name these things with. And so notice what happens the more you keep your enemy closer, as we like to say. What begins to happen to you when you are paying more attention to this? You may find that, oh my gosh, at first it feels a little overwhelming when I start to see where shame is. And that is the signal that your God is coming to find you and wants to have voices and bodies of people waiting to hear and receive you in the same way that he was receiving his son at his baptism. And then, as we often suggest, consider sharing what you're discovering with someone that you trust, as a way to build that community, as a way to realize that you are an outpost of God's beauty and goodness, and he wants you to share that with him and with others around you as we wait for his kingdom to appear in its fullness.
Thanks for being on my train, buddy.
Oh, dude. Right back at you.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. That's such a lovely thing to say.
It's true.
I am so, right on.
It's absolutely true.
Right on.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for today. This has been great. This has been great. I love you.
I love you too.
Hey, stick around on YouTube. Amy's going to be joining us for a post-show discussion, and that is always lively. See ya.
We are building a bigger train. Hey, Pep.
Yeah.
And
See, it's so good. Okay, I have a story about confessional communities. And I love the shame inventory. I mean, but I wanted to tell the story about confessional communities. So I was having coffee with friends, and one of the friends is dating. I mean, she's not well, I don't know. She's not dating one person. I mean, like, she's in the process of dating, and she was talking about the fact that her parents, what's important to them is for her to find a partner that has a prestigious job and a lucrative job and is educated. And she's realizing not only does she have her own insecurities about dating, talk about vulnerable, but then she's also realizing those really are not, I want to find a meaningful relationship. And that flies in the face of what her parents want. And so we're all talking. There's like 4 of us. And she has a very meaningful job. She has a profession that she loves. And one of the guys in the group said, you know what, Dana, this just washed over me, but I totally imagine you finding someone in your profession that you fall madly in love with. And It is all about the things that you've talked about meaningful, rich relationship. And when he said that, she just lit up because he was seeing something for her that's very hard for her to see because her attention very quickly goes to what she was raised with.
Yep.
And then it hit me that it's a vulnerable act to listen because, like Curt, you've said before, when we are listening, then we can share what we're sensing, imaging, and feeling. And we don't always know that that's going to be helpful.
Right.
Or, I've shared things before and you guys have gotten furious with the person that, like, you've expressed your anger. And that felt really good to me because I thought, okay, you guys are seeing it as I see it. And, but we don't know that as the listener, if we share what we're sensing, that's a vulnerable act because we don't know how it's going to be received.
Yeah.
But then I also and then I want to know what you guys are thinking, but I also like that when I'm listening to someone, I think I don't have to fix it. I can listen to them and then just be aware of what I'm sensing, what is happening in me. And that's what I can share.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot in today's episode about the role of the listener, about the I feel probably more in like a confessional community type setting, not necessarily, where Carla's going and talking to her husband and being vulnerable in that way, but like in the confessional community setting, and just how important that role is. I mean, obviously, it's the whole point. But I'm wondering, Curt, if there are even a few. And we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but even a few tips as that listener that are more helpful than not, because even unknowingly we can do something or say something that isn't helpful, right? And if you're fortunate enough to be in the situation where someone is bearing these things to you, you want to be able to respond in a way that would be helpful and not make a blundering mistake of some kind that.
I think it's a great question. I think there are two really concrete and immediately applicable practical kind of guidelines to consider. The one